everyone. Today we're going to read Snook Alone by Marilyn Nelson, illustrated by Timothy Basil Ehring. It's pretty. Deep gratitude to Father Jacques de Foix-Brown, whose hand-drawn maps and stories of solitary retreats on islands in St. Brandon's Atoll in the Indian Ocean guided my imaginings of Snook's adventures on Avocaire. Faith is like loving someone who is out there in the darkness but never appears, no matter how loudly you call. Ingmar Bergman. Oops. For Jen, Finn, and Sawyer, no storm will separate us. Snook Alone by Marilyn Nelson, illustrated by Timothy Basil Ehring. Abba Jacob was a monk who lived in a hermitage on an island in a faraway sea. His job was to pray and work, pray and work, pray and work all day. Abba Jacob's little rat terrier, Snook, was a black-on-white bundle of intellect energy, with brown cheeks and eyebrows and black floppy ears. His job was to catch the mice and rats that scurried through Abba Jacob's kitchen at night, and by day to be Abba Jacob's shadow. When Abba Jacob got up before dawn, Snook stretched his back legs and yawned, then trotted at his friend's heels up the steps into the chapel. Abba Jacob closed the door, sat down on a stool, put his feet flat on the floor, straightened his back, took a long, deep breath, and closed his eyes. Snook scratched behind both ears, curled up on the straw mat, sighed, and closed his. He heard the wind in the sugar canes, the me-singing birds, a distant, insistent rooster, a rumble of trucks, and the bee-buzzing of motorbikes. He heard the chatter and laughter of women on their way to work in the cane fields. When his friend stood up and bowed toward the little table in the corner, where the seashells and a candle and a picture of a lady holding a child, Snook shook himself and followed his friend out into the soft dawn light. They stepped down the stairs and went to work. Sometimes they worked in the sugar cane. Snook prowled the forest of stalks, and rats squealed with terror at his approach. Sometimes Snook routed a sleeping hare and won a high-speed race with a delicious prize. Sometimes they watered the coconut palms. Abba Jacob used a green hose. Sometimes Snook watched his friend harvest papayas or mangoes, guavas or breadfruit. Sometimes Snook lay alertly waiting and watched Abba Jacob work on the plumbing or the wiring of the hermitage, or sweep out the guest house or scrub the toilets. Then they had breakfast. Abba Jacob gave Snook the delicious chewy rind of his slice of cheese, or flipped him the crust of his bread. Sometimes Snook had a bite of fruit. Then Abba Jacob swallowed a last slurp of tea and put away his breakfast things. Snook followed him to the fish pool and prowled for mice, while Abba Jacob fed the carp and rescued the toads, lizards, geckos, and the odd hedgehog that had fallen in overnight. Sometimes Abba Jacob washed his hands, pulled a long white tunic over his shirt and trousers, buckled on a worn brown leather belt, got into his battered old car, and drove away. Snook waited. He listened. The wind, the birds, human sounds from the road. A frozen emptiness in time, until one special car, rattling up the gravel drive, roused him to attention, and he raced to meet it. There was the occasional interruption of humans stopping by, individually and as groups, to talk with Abba Jacob. But each day was a striped flag of silence, work, food, silence, work, silence. After the last silence, Abba Jacob blew out the candle, bowed, and walked down the steps and crossed the lawn to his house to go to bed. Snook slept on the veranda on a green cushion, with one ear periscoping out of sleep and every sleeping muscle poised. His friend rose to kneel again when the night sang only of crickets and when the moon was high. Snook followed them through the dark, They climbed the stairs to the chapel and descended into the silence. Snook stood at the point of the bow, his black ears flapping. The Society for the Preservation of St. Brandon's Atoll had asked Abba Jacob to help them catalog the plant and animal species on every island. Il Cocos, Il Long, Loup-garou, Sirène, Puito-o, Albatross. The catalogers were to make a quick circuit of the atoll and return to the home base. They were on a tight schedule, 1 island a day for 1 week. Snook was along to catch rats and mice, whose overbred numbers were decimating the seabirds' nesting grounds. The rats and mice ate eggs. Snook was to eat them. It was a good job. Like the other islands, Avocaire was a mile-long crescent of beach surrounding a higher ground of pemphis marshes, salt-resistant bushes, papaya and casuarina trees, and coconut palms, with bare guano-covered circles where boobies, frigate birds, and terns nested. What great micing! Snook had never worked so hard. A black line thickened on the horizon. The mood of the sea darkened. Ripples became waves. Waves became breakers. Abba Jacob hurried toward the boat, whistling and calling, "Snooky boy, come, Snook, come!" But there were still many unmarked casuarina trunks and rats that squealed with fear at Snook's approach. Snook was very busy. "Snook, Snook!" The wind snatched Abba Jacob's voice. The waves muted his whistle. "Snook, Snook!" Then the boat rushed Abba Jacob to safety with the other men in the expedition to ride out the gale anchored in the lee of a larger island. Casuarina branches 30 feet up roared like jet planes. Palm fronds crashed, coconuts thumped to the ground and rolled. Snook ran up and down the beach where the scent of Abba Jacob's footprints disappeared into noisy water. He barked into the wind. His ears rode it like pennants. His legs braced against it. But at last the wind bullied him into seeking shelter. He spent the night in a cave of pemphis roots. He slept fitfully, his ears awash in noise. In the morning, there were only faint sips of his friend's scent left for Snook to drink in here and there. He sat on the beach, watching a band of clear sky fill with streaming light. Snook was thirsty. He sniffed past the squealing rats and mice and the nesting birds quack quack as they rose in alarm and formed a black spiral overhead. He followed his nose to a sandy hollow in a circle of velvet-leafed arguesia bushes. There he dug, tentatively at first. Then, as the scent of fresh water grew stronger, he dug furiously, making the sand fly. At last he lapped sweet water. Then he made his well larger and drank and drank. On his way back down to the beach, he marked many trees. In the morning, there was no more trace of Abba Jacob on Avocaire Island, except inside Snook. In the evening, the sky unfurled a sea of stars over the sea, where Abba Jacob had disappeared. Snook sat between 2 shiny-leaved scaevola shrubs, which no dog on earth but he had ever marked, and waited for his friend. Snook woke up every morning before dawn. He waited. Then he foraged, moused, and drank. Then he waited again. The silence was black and empty. The silence was lonely. Snook sat on the beach. Around him lay scattered bits of pink and white coral, bright pieces of shells. Snook listened to the silence, to the wind and the waves. He waited. Snook's new home in the pemphis roots was wind-sheltered, dry, and cozy. He was curled there one night as waves crashed and a crescent moon rose, naked over the reef and the lagoon. Clack, 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 clack. Something was scurrying closer. Snook rushed out, barking a challenge. A Cardisoma land crab, as big as he was, clacked its larger claw at him, its stalk eyes expressionless as pebbles. When Snook lunged, the crab fended him off with his claw, like a boxer with one giant glove. Snook bravely defended his home, but the crab forged ahead like a robot tank. It moved into Snook's warren, claimed one corner, and stayed. Snook curled into the farthest corner and watched all night. In the silence, he listened. The wind was his breathing. The waves were his breath. Snook foraged in tide pools and stalked the lagoon's warm shallows, patiently waiting. When a slow fish swam near, Snook pounced with a splash. If he caught something, he carried it to the higher ground and ate delicately. If he caught nothing, the waiting and the splash were pure play. He learned to be cautious of the prowling baby sharks with their taste for everything alive. He learned to avoid chasing mice into the guano beds where the seabirds nested. What a cloud of foul dust that raised! Though he skirted them carefully, he had only to chase a mouse nearby to make the whole colony of boobies rise in a shimmer of sound and swoop screeching and poking their beaks at his head. Over his shoulder as he ran away, he saw the fluffy chicks sitting dumbfounded like a field of white teddy bears. There they are down there. Sometimes Snook watched the birds. The fairy terns, arrow-like white creatures, quick and agile, flew in mated pairs, dive-bombing the sea and flying home with little fishes dangling from their beaks like handlebar mustaches. The heavier, larger frigate birds often robbed them of their catch before they could get to their chicks. The terns soared back for a new catch, weaving together like streaks of playful light, every movement a synonym for joy. Sometimes two fairy terns hovered at Snook's eye level for seconds, watching him with curious eyes. That was curious eyes. The rooster interrupted me. He's one of our older roosters and he's particularly loud. Snook faced the changing sea light spreading before him. A wide, pale beach called up waves as far as he could see. My Snook. He sat on his haunches with his white front paws neatly in front of him, side by side. He sat with a straight little black on white back. He held his head up, his ears cocked. He waited. A frigate screamed. The casuarinas shirred or whistled or roared. The surf lapped the coral-strewn sand. Wind was like breathing. Snook watched the horizon at dawn, noon, at sunset. The incomprehensible vastness was a closed door to his friend. Breath was like waves. Snook waited as he had waited for the jubilation day rattle of his friend's car on the driveway to their hermitage. Every molecule listened for his friend. Wind, breath, breath, waves. A midnight commotion. A disturbance of the island's peace. Snook sprang to and sniffed for clues. Something new was out there. He raced across sand dunes, through clumps of argosilla. In the coconut grove near the tip of the island he stood, quivering, his nose twitching, his ears alert. By the shadow-casting light of a round moon, he saw many large beings lumbering slow and steady out of the ocean and up the beach. Snook trembled. They were very large. Their bodies did not bend. Some of them were using their wide-back flippers to scoop hollows in the sand. Snook crept closer. They seemed harmless, intent on some mysterious, urgent business. Snook watched gingerly among them, his hackles raised. From the verge where sea meets sand, he heard splashing, thrashing, live terror, a last rush of voracious hunger. One of the beings, just emerging from inky water, was someone else's prey. Something huge, something dreadful, Snook growled. With awkward flippers, the prey scrabbled heavily up the beach. The hunter hurled itself out of the sea in burning bright pursuit. Its dark-striped body was one sleek muscle with rows of glittering teeth, an omnivorous, fathomless eye. It looked at Snook for one instant the way Snook looked at rats. Then it snatched its prey by one flipper and in one smooth arc muscled itself and its flailing prey back into its element. By afternoon, the northwest beach had been scored by dozens of carapaces, the high, dry sand dug up and covered by many graceless flippers. But one last turtle was still digging. Snook lay in the scant shade of a Suriana and watched her labor. Her beak open as if to pant, she dug with one rear flipper and one heeled stump. Her eyes, half closed, streamed tears. She seemed as old as the world. She laid dozens of eggs, covered them with sand, and as dark fell, dragged her weight back to the deep. Snook lifted his nose and howled. In the sky, Orion released an arrow. For days after, the sea was a green turtle's weeping eye. Snook waited for his friend's soothing voice to emerge from its hiding place beneath the waves, from its hiding place beneath the wind in the trees. Snook sat still enough to find the shared silence of Abba Jacob's chapel under the rhythmic surge of surf. He could almost hear, almost make out, like a whisper in a cyclone, the voice he was waiting to hear. "Good boy, Snook. Good dog." Snook wagged his tail. There were finds of flotsam, full moons of fishing buoys, tidbits of shark's meals, a plastic soft drink bottle, some pieces of styrofoam. Some of this was good to eat. Some of it was good to play with. Some was good to roll in. Thus camouflaged, Snook stalked his island in a wolf-sized cloud of stink. The rats didn't know what hit them. But Avocare Island was the center of a vast circle of longing. And from one unknown direction, Snook's longing came back to him, mirrored in a fractal of moving sea light, one flicker of which was Abba Jacob's prayer. Wind, breathing, breath, waves. Good dog. Love went in Snook now from one end of Avocare to the other, from east to west, south to north. Whether the noon sun blazed overhead or the Southern Cross blinked down at night, whether he was working or eating or dozing, Snook was always waiting now in his friend's silence. Abba Jacob's silence was the wind. It was the sea. It was the love in Snook, compassionate and wise as the turtle's eye. One day, the good ending came. A dock grew to be a fishing craft, which sent an inflatable motorboat with a tall man standing in its prow. Snook trembled on the beach, watching. Then he jumped and raced in a yapping circle of pea-dribbling delight. As the boat skimmed sand and the man at the tiller cut the motor, Abba Jacob splashed out. He ran to meet the barking somersault that leapt into his arms. "Oh, Snook," he said, "good dog." Snook whimpered against his friend's chest. He licked his chin, his ears. Abba Jacob laughed. "You silly, horrible little beastie, you." Good dog, Snooky boy. Good dog. That was quite a story. Have a great day.